Of course, Bassam Tibi's presentation was so rich that I should just get up and say he said everything I wanted to say. But I'll add one or two remarks. Basically, I'm going to be addressing the question of how to address the Iranian challenge. And I think any analysis has to begin with the changing balance of power in the Middle East. They used to call the conflict the Arab-Israeli conflict. Well, there hasn't been an Arab-Israeli conflict since the Lebanese War. There's no Israeli-Arab conflict anymore. It's basically an Israeli-Iranian or Israeli-Palestinian. The only Arabs that are confronting Israel today are proxies of Iran. So it's the Arab-Iranian, it's the Israeli-Arab, maybe Iranian conflict, but certainly isn't the Israeli-Arab conflict. And why is this? Because basically there's been an historical shift in the balance of power. It's really historical. It's been going on for 30, 40 years. And it involves the ascendance of the non-Arab regional powers at the expense of the Arab states. So on the ascendant in the past 2 decades, by any criteria imaginable, imaginable, whether you look at it in terms of GNP, if you look at scientific publications, the states that are on the ascendant are Israel, Iran, and Turkey. And the states that are in complete decline are the Arab states. In fact, it's so radical that one can say that the return to history by the Arab states, after all, the Arabs were defeated when the Abbasid Empire came to an end 600 years ago, and then they re-emerged into history as the decolonization process took place in the mid-50s. One can even say that the return to history by the Arabs has basically been a brief phenomenon because it's almost coming to an end. And that's one of the problems that Israel is facing in its challenge to Iran. So that's one major aspect in the shifting balance of power. Of course, it was aided by the Americans when they destroyed the Sunni state of Iraq, which was replaced basically by a Shiite state, and the Iraq will remain a Shiite state. I mean, there's no return to a Sunni Arab state in Iraq. That's one aspect of this change of power. And the second aspect of the changing regional balance of power is American retrenchment. Now here, while I can say that the decline of Arab states seems to be almost linear and inevitable, about the United States, it's much less clear. Why is it less clear? I mean, it seems that it is the case because that's the major thread that connects between Obama and Trump. From that point of view, they're equal in seeking to retrench, in seeking to withdraw as much as possible from being the world's policeman. Why do I still cast doubt about American retrenchment? Because of its sheer military prowess. The military prowess of the United States is something that few people in the room or even I can countenance. And 2 to 3 weeks ago, we just had a small taste of it. When the United States sent whatever it sent, we don't even know whether it sent planes or it sent missiles, and suddenly we hear that over 100 Hezbollah, Syrian military were killed in the Deir Azur area. In other words, the United States has such power that it can use it, even small doses of it, to make a tremendous change in the balance of power. All it has to do is to have the will to use it. And that's what we're talking about. That's what we're questioning, whether the United States has a sustained will to decide what that balance of power will be. So that's more of a question mark. The third aspect of the changing balance of power is basically that we're talking about two big states. Well, I have to move. Two big states that were whose recent history is informed by radical ideological transformation, but the retention of traditional imperial ambitions. This is a very bad concoction. It's a very bad concoction when you have states that are ideologically radical, but maintain an imperial identity and imperial ambitions. Now, I would say that Turkey was checked by the Marmara affair, one of the most positive incidents that happened in Israeli history. Israel established a red line to Turkish imperial ambition. Gaza was not going to be a Turkish colony, and the Jewish state was not going to be a dhimmi state. Now, we have lots of left-wing people in Israel who give that kind of feeling that is what Israel wants to be, but it isn't, and we stopped that in Marmara. But why were we effective? Because the Turkish economy is not an oil-based economy, an energy-based economy. It's an internationalized economy, and Erdogan began learning the hard way the limitations of imperial ambition in the face of geostrategic liabilities. And one of the liabilities is the state of Israel, the Israeli Air Force. So we've been more successful with Turkey. But Iran is truly a radical imperial state. And the best proof of that is that it's the only state in the Middle East, and we're talking about a very volatile, aggressive region, but it's the only state that projects power 1,000 and volatile, aggressive power 1,000 beyond, above 1,000 kilometers from its borders, against a state, the state of Israel, that for years showed a pro-Iranian bias. As we remember in the Contra affair of the late 1980s, there was a powerful lobby in the Israeli establishment that believed that we could do business with the Ayatollahs. And they kept on teaching us through Hezbollah, and then later Hamas, that they weren't going to do business with us. But they're the only state. Even Turkey today, when it fights in Ifrin, it's fighting just across its borders to maintain what it perceives as the security of the Turkish state. Saudi Arabia tries building up proxies beyond its borders, way beyond its borders, only in reaction to Iranian aggression. This is a clear sign of imperialism. Imperialism is when you establish bases of power and points of contention against actors who never wanted to fight you in the first place. I'll skip the next because we really, Bassam already talked about it, and I'm sure Benny is going to talk about it, that foreign interventions just kept on helping Iran. And the latest intervention, which is a problem for Israel and its so-called Sunni allies, is that basically the United States, in fighting the jihadists, in fighting ISIS, and I made it in bold, is basically fighting on behalf of Iran. This is a very difficult thing to say to the American public, and there's a reason for it. I used to think that when radical Islam territorialized, built up a territorial base, it gave up on international terrorism. And I had a methodologist who crunched numbers to test that hypothesis. I was wrong. You get more terror when you have an Islamic state as a state. So the Americans are right in fighting the Islamic State in any territory in the Middle East because it does protect from it protects the United States from Islamic terrorism. But at the same time, we can't deny the fact that the fight against that who's the major beneficiary of the fight against the Islamic State? Iran. And I can show you give you one example of this. Who destroyed the Shiite crescent in 2014 that stretched from Tehran to Beirut as it's beginning to stretch again? It was the Islamic State. Israel had a fundamental interest in creating a Sunnistan on the borders between Syria and Iraq. But it's very hard to demand of the Americans that they prioritize the fight against Iran over the fight against the Islamic State. So what has to be done to meet Iranian imperialism? So the basic argument is that Iran, and I think Bassam also alluded to this, Iran has an integrated, consistent imperialist policy towards its surrounding environment. The United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, we all work not in tandem, must develop similarly a consistent, integrated, offensive policy to address Iran. Strategically, it's to convince the United States to prioritize the containment of Iran over the fight against ISIS and similar versions. I mean, there'll be other versions. That's easier said than done. A more integrated response. The United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia should announce that they will work with other states to roll back Iranian imperialism. I suggest that Iranian imperialism should be the frame for this integrated response. Financially, Iran is not a wealthy country. It's relatively successful. In HDI, it's 66th out of 188 countries. It's ranked by the World Bank as an upper middle class state. It's a relatively successful state. No one can deny it. It's a modern state. But we've had economic riots. These economic riots are much more important than the riots in 2010 because the 2010 riots or upper middle class. And the upper middle class never make up for more than 21% of society. They'll never get rid of the Ayatollahs. It's only economic riots that maybe can dent. So this is important. Now, at least 3 of Iran's major arenas drain Iranian resources. I mean, one of the great advantages that the United States has is that it's the only country in the world with allies where they might be free riders on American security, but the United States and these allies mutually benefit from economic interchange. Most other states, China, Russia, they only have allies that drain their resources. This is true of Iran as well. Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon drain Iranian resources. So what do we have to do? We have to make sure that these arenas drain even more resources from the Iranian treasury. So that maybe these economic riots continue and develop. So we have to create sanctions. So sanctions and driving up the costs of proxy wars is very, very important. The importance of Iraq in this regard. Iraq is the only country where Iran is doing great business. Iran is making sure that Iraq is doing everything possible to undermine the Iraqi-Iranian border. Why is this? Because production costs are cheaper in Iran, and therefore Iraq becomes the captive market for Iranian goods. The Iranians claim that they sell $12 billion. It's the major export arena. According to World Bank, this is not true, but this is what Iran claims. The United States should work to disband the Shiite militias, which is how Iran controls Iraq. This is all the creation since the rise of the Islamic State, and it should work on reasserting Iraqi borders so that Iraq can develop infant industry protection and keep out Iranian goods and cut that golden goose that lays the golden eggs. This is very difficult. We'll see in the coming May elections, what's going to happen. What we also have to do is get the Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, countries that free ride on U.S. security umbrella, but they sleep with the enemy. They do a lot of business with Iran. In fact, United Arab Emirates is the second biggest export market for Iran. And if you look at the flight arrivals of Dubai, which is the 4th biggest airport in the world, major destinations are Tehran and others. So I mean, the United States clearly has to be compelling these countries to act in a more integrated response against Iran. Not easy. The military response. To ask the United States to coordinate the financing, training, and arms supplies of proxies between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and in Israel in order to make these proxies more effective forces. I'm glad to hear that Israel is finally getting involved. It's even reporting that it's getting involved in beefing up the proxies in Syria. This should have been done long time ago. Israel can't adopt, these strategic red lines and say it's only if it affects our immediate strategic interests. No, what happens, we're no different from Turkey and we're no different from Iran. We have to get into the Syrian arena and make sure that the people we want to win. And then we have to continue and expand air and missile attacks by unidentified planes, which is really, it's a great response. And finally, we should consider widening U.S., Israeli, and Saudi red lines to include targets in Iran that are related to the financing, training, and provision of arms to these proxies within Iran itself. This is important because it brings home to the domestic Iranian audience the costs of Iranian imperialism. Finally, a broad division of labor. The United States must mobilize, coordinate, and strike. Israel has to militarily strike. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have to concentrate on the finance. Finally, I want to say one must not exaggerate the threat of Iran. Iran is not Nazi Germany. It's the seventh biggest economy. Nazi Germany was the second. Nazi Germany was probably either the most technological country of its time or the second most. Iran has a relatively non-complex, under-diversified, non-technological economy. Iran has low fertility rates. They're going to be very reluctant within 5-7 years' time to send anyone to fight. They have small families and therefore increasingly reluctant to fight. Iran is a bottlenecked country. Iranian vulnerability, 90% of the energy exports come from one port. Energy exports account for 80% of total exports, and the Iranians have to feel that and that 90% of its container freight, which is basically what a modern economy needs to live a modern life, runs through one port, Bandar Abbas, and the Iranians should know that if they send Hezbollah after Israel, they have to know that these two ports are going to be liable objectives for Israeli retribution. Thank you very much.